Richard Chambers, who is president and CEO of the Institute of Internal Auditors. He joins me here live around the desk in Hong Kong. It's great to have you here in Asia for a change. You know, I want to get to this story out of Japan. I know you can't talk specific companies, but this latest report coming out of Suzuki, Yamaha, and Mazda about falsifying emissions, this seems like a narrative that we've heard before. Nissan, another company that's done it as well. And what we're hearing increasingly, at least out of the Japanese car makers, is this pressure perhaps to stay competitive and continue to push ahead of its competitors that's leading to a lot of this oversight. Is that how you view it?
Yes. So first of all, thank you for having me. It's great to be here in Asia. You know, it's just hard for me to believe that 3 years after Volkswagen, we're still talking about emissions reporting errors. And while the reports that are coming out about the ones by the Japanese automakers don't indicate the kind of wrongdoing maybe that was admitted to in Volkswagen, it still, to me, just is a reflection of the fact that 21st century corporations still don't get risk management. This is a risk that isn't emerging. It emerged. It emerged 3 years ago, that if you report bad or inaccurate information about emissions, you're going to be in for all kinds of problems. The markets are not going to treat you well. The regulators are not going to treat you well. So I think we've heard this story before is absolutely the way I would put it.
Why do you think they aren't catching on to risk management? As you point out, the Volkswagen thing, I mean, this is something that played out over several months here. This wasn't a small story. Is it companies looking at that storyline to say, well, that won't necessarily be something that happens within our space?
You know, I think you kind of touched on it a minute ago. I think there's certainly pressure, and it's not unique to the auto industry. There are pressures in every industry to meet earnings expectations, to meet metrics that drive the business. I think what companies often fail to do is to anticipate that there's going to potentially be an ends justifies the means culture that emerges. That is, that we're going to get measured, we're going to get compensated, we're going to get rewarded based on the results that are generated and not necessarily based on how we do it. One of the things we tell the internal auditors all the time is you got to get in there and look at the culture of the company as part of the audits that you're doing and see if that kind of culture is in place where people are being pressured to meet certain expectations.
Okay, Richard, I want to bring in oil into the conversation.
Thanks, Kiko. How do you get that kind of information to come through, especially from auditors going inside a company? I mean, I would imagine it would be quite difficult to judge whether or not that culture is there, because that wouldn't necessarily be something that's openly discussed within a company.
Well, as the internal auditors in modern companies are into almost every aspect of the operations, they're going to be looking at how the financial operations are being conducted, but they're also going to be looking at compliance. They're going to be involved in essence, every facet of the company. And typically, when they find a problem, they're going to be looking to see, well, what was the root cause? What really caused non-compliance here? And a lot of times, they'll find that it was a culture, maybe, that pressure to meet expectations, or, as I said a few minutes ago, ends justifies the means, sometimes will override everything else. And so that's the kind of culture that they should be on the outlook for. And at the end of the day, this is a board responsibility. Board of directors in modern companies, I think, are shirking their duty when it comes to overseeing risk management. And they're the ones who are ultimately there to watch this kind of thing for the shareholders.
Richard, who does it first? I mean, who does it best, rather? You run a global organisation. You look at this type of situation all over the world. Who's really leading the pack here?
You're talking about in terms of companies or in terms of industries? I'm not sure.
In terms of companies. In terms of companies.
Well, I would tell you that without naming specific companies, the financial services industry is probably leading the pack right now in terms of looking at risk and risk management. And look, that's coming out of the global financial crisis. If we'd been talking 10 years ago, I wouldn't have been talking about the financial services industry leading the pack. But today, they've got regulators breathing down their necks. The internal audit function in the banks has become widely respected. They report directly to the boards in many cases. So yeah, financial services gets it. I'm not sure that every institution in financial services is there yet, But as an industry, they're probably ahead of a lot of the others. But the auto industry has really got some catching up to do. We shouldn't be hearing the same stories 3 years after Volkswagen.
Here in the region, we've seen a lot of governments push for higher corporate governance standards, especially in places like South Korea, as well as Japan. You know, it's not the same culture, as you point out, in place in terms of you know, looking to return, you know, give return to shareholders, looking for more shareholder, you know, they're not quite as vocal, I guess you could say. Have we seen the changes? I mean, have those changes coming from the government actually been effective?
You know, I think corporate governance, the quality of it and the performance of corporate governance varies significantly around the world. And about every time you think that one region is maybe stepping ahead, then there's some big failure there. I think the real issue to me is, does the company have a strong and effective board in place that is independent enough to oversee the actions of management? A lot of times a board is perhaps even unfortunately handpicked by the CEO. The CEO maybe serves as the chairman of the board, and there's a reluctance to challenge the actions of or question. Look, what I think is boards have to bring professional skepticism to their roles. They can't just simply say, we got a great CEO, we're going to step back and let him or her do their job. There needs to be some oversight. Yeah,
that independence is certainly key, but also been one of the key issues here in Asia. If you talk about a place like Japan, I mean, how do you convince these companies to change up the culture on that front, saying that, look, this is going to lead to obviously higher standards, but, you know, an increase in their bottom line?
I think the markets will be the ultimate judge of the effectiveness of corporate governance. Unfortunately, it's often too late. By the time the markets punish a corporate governance failure, it's too late. So I think the regulators need to have a much louder voice in this. And I think shareholders have an obligation to make sure they put a board in that's going to be there to represent their interests.
Okay, we'll have to leave it there. Richard, good to have you on today.
Thank you.
Richard Chambers joining us from the Institute of Internal Auditors.